Okay, well, I'm delighted to be here with my old colleague Jack Zenger, and just really tickled to be working with Jack and the Zenger Folkman crew again. So in this podcast, or I guess it's a webcast, we'll be looking at why we are partnering with Zenger Folkman, why the Clemmer Group is reconnected, and Jack will talk a little bit about why Zenger Folkman is delighted to be partnering with us in Canada. And then Jack will do an overview of the foundation program that Zenger Folkman is really built around, which is called the Extraordinary Leader, and it's the whole Extraordinary Leader development system. And then I'll come back and interview Jack, and Joe Folkman will be joining us as well to talk about what makes Zenger Folkman Leadership Development System so uniquely powerful. And then we'll wrap up and move on to next steps from there. So let's jump right into why is it that we're excited to be partnering with Zenger Folkman. And the first point is the reconnection with Jack. I was delighted to work with Jack in my previous consulting company, the Achieve Group, back in the 80s and early 90s. And from what I've seen, again, Jack has pulled together another very strong team and very values-based organization around what you'll be hearing about is some pretty powerful research and very powerful approaches. And it's that second point around strength-based leadership that really had me particularly interested, because I've been writing a fair bit in the last few years about positive psychology and the whole focus on strengths and just how much more powerful that approach is for building a strong culture and for building effectiveness, whether it's our overall personal effectiveness or leadership effectiveness. So we're delighted to be to actually have a tool, a mechanism that is, to the third point, steeped in evidence and research, and is very solidly constructed and put together. Not just a bunch of theories and concepts. There's hundreds of thousands of books and concepts and websites and all kinds of things around on leadership, and Zenger Folkman people have really put something together that cuts through a lot of that opinions and theories and gets into what really makes the big difference and what really makes for strong leadership. And then a fourth point is the overall philosophy about coaching. A few years ago I had reviewed Jack's book on the Extraordinary Coach and found it just phenomenally well-written, practical book, but even more so were the underlying philosophies around the key role of a leader to develop people, and the whole building and developing of people as really being the essence of what leadership is all about. And so those philosophies I see very much continued on in the Inspiring Leader, in the new book that Jack will touch on briefly that has just come out this summer called How to Be Exceptional. All of this material is very much steeped around those approaches of building and developing people and strengthening leadership. And lastly, the fit then with these approaches and our culture and leadership development and what we've been doing at the Clemmer Group for almost the last 2 decades is hand in glove. It just fits very strongly, and we're delighted to be having that kind of synchronicity. So I'm going to turn it over to Jack in terms of why Zenger Folkman is partnering with us.
You bet. Well, first of all, I think we've realized for some time that the Canadian market is an extremely important one. Not only is it sort of it's our next door neighbor, and we already had a few clients in Canada, but we realized that we could do better, and we could do better for our clients, and that we could do better in terms of really covering that market if we found a valued partner. And so as we began to think about that, instantly the Clemmer Group came to mind. And that brings me to the second point, which is that, as Jim has noted, we have a long history of working together back into the early 1980s. I would just make a side note that it's one of the few times I've seen in business where two organizations work together on the basis of a handshake, and that was a very successful kind of a trusted partnership between us for more than a 20-year period of time. And the third point, I guess, is that we do believe that the marketing capabilities and the delivery capabilities and the sales capacity of the Clemmer Group will really enable us to have some real synergy. They bring some good ideas and some good information that we certainly will take advantage of. And so for those reasons, I guess we are just really excited about this new partnership, Jim.
Oh, that's great. Well, Jack, I'd love to have you just do a bit of an overview. I know there's so much depth to all of the material, and you've continued to grow and build and expand on this excellent base that you have. But if you can maybe just walk us through the next series of slides on what is the essence of the extraordinary leadership. It's really a development system that you've built here.
It is. Well, thanks. So it begins with the fact that my colleague, Joe Folkman, who will kind of be introduced to your listeners a little bit later on, Joe had been processing 360-degree feedback instruments for a variety of organizations, including his own, and had over time amassed a very large database. It consisted of some 200,000 evaluations pertaining to about 20,000 managers. And Joe and I came together as a company called Provant had brought several companies in the training space together. And as I got to know Joe and heard about this wonderful body of data, I began sort of inquiring if there weren't some wonderful lessons to be learned from further analysis. So he and I began looking at some of the data, and what we did was to sort of use a pretty simple technique of comparing the people who got the highest aggregate scores, the top 10%, compared them to the lowest 10%, and said, so which of all these competencies that these instruments are measuring, which of those competencies truly separates the highest performing from the not so high performing people? And I will admit that it really did change some of my views about leadership, and we've published that research in a couple of books, one called The Extraordinary Leader, and then, as you've mentioned, a brand new one that will be out in September of 2012, which is How to Be Exceptional, Driving Leadership Success by Magnifying Your Strengths. One of the fundamental ideas, as you know, Jim, in the book is, and both books, is this notion of leadership being, in a way, symbolized by a tent, and that the size of the tent describes kind of how you expand the capacities of leaders. And the 5 tent poles in this, albeit old-fashioned tent, not a modern-day backpacker's tent, but these 5 tent poles represent the 5 major buckets of competencies. And here on this slide we have described what those are exactly. So the center pole is the center pole of character. We know that the most effective leaders are those who truly exemplify high integrity and honesty. Then there's a tent pole over on the right-hand side that we've called personal capability, that describes those things that you hope a leader would learn early in his or her career, being technically competent, being able to solve problems, being innovative, and being able to practice some self-development. And then we have these 2 very important components of a leader's ability to focus on results, and realizing that leadership ultimately is about producing good results for the organization. And then finally a group of competencies that we've called leading change, that describe the skills of the most senior leaders in the company. And then the cluster that is so important to a leader's success, that is being capable interpersonally, having the ability to work collectively with people, to be cooperative, collaborative, and the competency that we found to be the single most powerful competency, inspiring and motivating people to high performance. And the rest of those, the other interpersonal skills, round out the rest of those 16 differentiating competencies. What we found was that these were the ones that, for most organizations, most of the time, predicted success. Now, what's really powerful about this idea, I think, is that you see that these have an amazing outcome. They're not just descriptions of people's personal styles, but they basically are very predictive in terms of what kind of business results you see. Here we see just one example of that. This shows the impact on employee engagement. And if you look at those leaders who were in the bottom decile, or bottom 10%, you see that their impact on employee engagement, they're at the 9th percentile. And then as you move up to that next group, the 11th to the 35th percentile, 35th to the 65th, and then so on, you see that the top 10% of leaders, based on their 360 scores, have employee engagement scores of 90%. And certainly everyone realizes what a huge difference it is if you walk in the office in the morning and you've got 9% of your people who are really engaged versus you've got 90% of your people engaged. We have a vast number of measures of profitability, customer satisfaction, employee retention. Virtually everything we've ever measured has this correlation between 360 your feedback scores and those outcome measures. Which leads us, I guess, then to the next question about, so how do you become a truly exceptional leader? And maybe there are three fundamental avenues people have thought about. One is that some have thought that if I can just get rid of all my weaknesses, then that'll make me a wonderful leader. There are those who have said, well, maybe if I can get pretty good at everything, maybe if I can sort of be generally quite capable at everything. Or there are those who would say, no, it really depends, really hinges on my being really good at a few things. Let's just kind of look at the data that we have. The data would say the first two approaches have never made people exceptional leaders. And as you see here on this next slide, yes, removing fatal flaws gets you to ground zero, but it doesn't get you much beyond that. What truly happens is that if you have fatal flaws and no strengths, on average you're at the 18th percentile. If you have no fatal flaws and no strengths, you're where you would suspect you'd be. You're right in the middle. But when you have people who have profound strengths, combined with the fact that they don't have any fatal flaws, then they're up at the 81st percentile. This next slide maybe paints a little bit clearer picture. So as you see here, people with only one strength have moved now from basically the being right dead set in the middle to the 64th percentile. Then two strengths takes them to the 74th percentile. Three strengths takes them to the 80th percentile. You see this enormously, strong growth in capability, even though it's only based on a small number of competencies. That's the great discovery. And so, the other thing, I guess, that I would want all of your listeners to hear is that there's been always this question of, can people really become better? Can they develop? Can they improve? And I want everyone kind of in the sound of our voices to know that we've got some pretty strong data that says absolutely, year over year, if we look at people at one point in time at the 57th percentile, a year later they're at the 65th percentile, we see them being able to keep making progress. That then brings us, though, to another point, and that is the point that you alluded to earlier, and that is if people will focus on their strengths, they will get even greater results than if they'll just focus on trying to fix their weaknesses. So here we see in this slide a group of people who worked on correcting their weaknesses. Yep, they got better, 12% better. If they built their strengths, they were 26% improvement. So every time we've measured this comparison of people who worked on weaknesses versus building their strengths, we've seen that focusing on strengths just is a lot more successful as a strategy for development. The rest of the system that you have alluded to, Jim, has to do with our feeling that so much of it is based on being able to get good feedback. Mm-hmm. And so we've constructed a really powerful 360-degree feedback instrument. As I suspect a lot of your listeners will know, that a very high percentage of leading firms around the world use a 360-degree feedback process as a very central part of their leadership development offerings. And why? Because they found it works. It works really effectively. It makes a big difference. And I think the big reason is that leaders gain information that they would otherwise have never been able to have access to. So here on the next slide, we've listed some 10 elements that we think are helpful in creating a best-of-class 360-degree feedback instrument. Given our time constraints here, I'm not going to go through all of these in any kind of detail, but just in brief, we found that when you empirically kind of determine what things to measure, you get far better results. Skipping down a little bit to number 3, we report the data and show people how they compare not just to the mean average, but how they compare to the 75th and 90th percentile. Why? Because that's where we want people to aspire to. And as all of our earlier data shows, it's when people are up there at those higher realms of performance on a few competencies, that's where they see the really big gains. So anyway, we think the 360-degree feedback instrument can have a number of very powerful qualities that really then helps it to have an ever more important role in this development process. And we're happy to answer any questions that people might have about and give them samples of the one that we've created and explain why we think these 10 elements are so crucial. The next slide kind of shows a little bit about just the nature of the feedback report that people receive. And we think that it is helpful when people get a report that's very easy to digest. The data is really accessible. It's not laborious and doesn't require people kind of studying a bunch of, a table of numbers, but really kind of shows them in a graphic kind of way where their strengths are and any flat sides that they might have. The one very nice element we think of our 360-degree feedback instrument is the inclusion of a kind of a mini employee survey. So there's 5 questions in there that are responded to only by the direct reports. And these 5 questions are asking questions about, is this a good place to work? And would you recommend this as a place for one of your friends to come to work? Are you confident that the organization will achieve its strategic goals? All in all, are you satisfied working here? This correlates very highly with all the conventional and well-known employee survey instruments, and it lets you know the impact that the leader has on the people whom he or she is currently managing. The last item that we'll just mention is that one of the rich parts of any 360-degree feedback instrument is the written comments, but we think that it's important to ask, what's the person really good at? What are their strengths? Do they have any fatal flaws that will kind of get them in trouble? And what's really important for a person in this position to be doing? One of the fundamental ideas we talk about in our system, Jim, is this trying to help people think about, so what do I work on? What do I want to get better at? Mm-hmm. And we try to help them understand this combination of what are they good at, what are they passionate about, and what does the organization need from them. And we've kind of shown them a process by which they can analyze these 3 things, find where those 3 circles kind of overlap, and identify that as the leadership sweet spot that they're kind of really targeting their development efforts to. And therefore, when they've gone through that process, we then help them to select some items that really do fit in that sweet spot, clearly play on their passions. And that then brings us, Jim, I guess, to one of the most fascinating kind of elements of the whole system, and that has to do with, so is building a strength exactly the same thing as working on a weakness? And one of, I think, the most interesting things about our research is this notion of leadership cross-training.
Mm-hmm.
The idea here is simply this. You're familiar with runners, and probably we hear this term cross-training most frequently used with long-distance runners who have determined that they can only run a certain number of miles in a week, and so they begin doing other things. So they swim, they ride bicycles, they lift weights, they do a variety of things. The fundamental idea is that you are engaging in some activities that have been shown to really help you get better at the thing that ultimately is your target development plan. So one day Joe walked into my office, and we were in the middle of doing research for the book, and he says to me, Jack, I found something really interesting. He said, for every
aha moment?
This is one of those aha moments, yes. He said, for every one of those 16 differentiating competencies, there's a handful of some other behaviors that go hand in hand with those. So a person that gets a high score on this differentiating competency gets a high score on this cluster of other behaviors. And similarly, low score, they get a low score on these same behaviors. Do you find that interesting?
Yes.
And you can kind of guess,
yeah.
You guess my response, and yours was the same. Absolutely, I find that interesting. So we think one of the really fun and important contributions we've made to this field may well be this notion that if you want to get better at a given competency, find the things that are statistically significantly correlated with that and help people to identify what those are and use those as a way to build a strength. Now, it's not just marathon runners that do cross-training. Other people do cross-training as well, but I think the idea really does play out. We've given you a slide here that maybe tries to explain a little bit about why these companion competencies, or these competency companions, make a difference. And let me quickly say to your audience, though, the honest answer is we don't really know. We're guessing, and here are our best guesses, but we don't truly know why they are correlated. We just know that they are, and they give every indication then of helping people to get better. Maybe an example might be I mentioned that this differentiating competency of being inspiring and motivating has been found to be the single most powerful competency that we measure. And obviously when people hear that, they wonder, okay, well, so how do I get better at that? What could I do?
And your book, The Inspiring Leader, was really built around that notion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The book, The Inspiring Leader, was based around that notion. But then it proceeds to give the companion behaviors that have been shown to be statistically significantly correlated, which then gives people some better ideas about what they might do to be a more inspiring leader. It really does, I think, gives people some very good insights in how to move from good to great. And this next slide just gives one more example. Being technically and professionally expert, if someone wanted to get better at that, what might they do? And around these bubbles that go around the competency, you see them starting out with solving problems and analyzing issues and building strong relationships. I find one of the most interesting ones the one on communication. So by people realizing that no matter how smart you are, if you don't communicate what you know well, and if you're not willing to communicate what you know, people won't know about your strong technical capability.
Well, it's similar to the intriguing example of integrity and honesty.
Yeah.
If we need to improve our integrity and honesty, well, how do you be more honest?
Right.
How do you have more integrity?
Yeah.
But the example that you came up with along the same lines is, well, maybe I need to speak up more. Maybe I need to take stands on things.
Yes, one of the companion behaviors that was correlated with high integrity and honesty was being assertive. And when a lot of people first see that, they kind of scratch their heads and say, gosh, I don't understand how those two things fit together. But if they begin to think about it, they begin to see why. I guess some of the last ideas I'd like to talk about, Jim, is that you and I have been in this profession for a long time, and we've known that so much of the success of all this really hinges on people's ability to not only have a good experience, but then to sustain it through a variety of follow-on activities.
Absolutely.
And
There's
we
too much
have
spray and pray that happens in many development sessions. Yeah.
That's right. So we've worked really hard, and we continue to work on a variety of tools to help keep this in place, to keep it alive, to sustain it, to provide follow-up. And
this is part of what I think makes it a system. It's not a series of events or activities, you're turning it into an entire system.
We have some interesting data here from Marshall Goldsmith. He and a fellow named Holman published an article a few years ago on the research that they had done showing where managers had gone through a development process and did not do any follow-up, and comparing that to those where the manager had done some follow-up. And as you see the comparison of these two slides, you see that each of these bars represents a different company that they were looking at. But this was a large database, and it really did just nail down, very empirically what a powerful idea this notion of follow-through and sustainability really provides. So I guess I'll toss it back to you now, and just to kind of wrap up in terms of your views about why this all fits together as a system.
Well, thanks, Jack. I think it's an excellent overview of the base of the system, and there's so much more to it. It's a nice skip over the icebergs, I think of it as. So to me, it seems like there are four main things that really make this system stand out. And I want to just highlight those four and then get Joe and both of you involved in just understanding them a little bit further. So the first one is around strength-based leadership. You've spoken to it. It's clearly one of the key elements that differentiates what you've been doing, and I want to get a little deeper into why you've gone down that road and some of the impact of that a little bit further. And then the idea that, as you've spoken to, building this with evidence. And I know you've used the analogy similar to medicine in the healthcare field, that the practice of medicine, yes, it is an art and a science, but we need to rely sometimes a little more on the science side of things when prescribing and deciding what sort of treatment path to take forward. Thirdly, I think, is the building of a highly personalized development plan. So often people that go through 360s, as you said, many people do that, they get the report and really don't get much help with what to do with it. And aren't really
in some cases
along.
It gets emailed to them.
Yes,
and there's
right.
there's no system or no plan about it at all.
Right.
And that's the great tragedy. It's just a momentary event.
I want to come back to that and talk about that one just a little bit further. And then the best of class, you touched on 10 points of the multi-rater tool that you use. I'd like to just zero in on a couple of those, maybe especially with Joe as being one of the developer.
The grand architect.
Pulled it together, yes, exactly.
That's right.
So let's come back maybe to each of those 4 points and talk about each one of them in just a little bit more depth. You touched on, Jack, the use of strengths and the importance of building on strengths versus weaknesses. How did you really come upon that concept? Strength-based leadership is now becoming a little more widely used and known and written about. You were really at the very early stages. I would even say some of the pioneers in that area of looking at strengths. How did that come about?
Well, Jim, we didn't we didn't assume that we were going to have that position. I mean, we didn't go looking for strength-based development because I think I had been I'd spent 25 years giving people feedback and telling them to focus on their weaknesses.
Right,
okay.
Right. Which is what a lot of 360s tend to do, right?
Right.
You zero right in on weaknesses.
But Jack is a curious guy. He keeps asking questions, and you give him some data, and then he asks more questions. And I can't exactly remember how it went about. We were doing some analysis, and we were looking at what would happen if, again, we were trying to answer this question, what makes a leader great? When you looked at really great leaders, what was the difference? And so we did this analysis where we looked at people's strengths and the number of strengths that they had. And we were shocked to find out that huge jump. And it only took 3 strengths to get to the 81st. It shocked us. I know the first time I ran it, Jack said, "Go run it again."
I think, Jim, this is a classic case of if you'll not enter into a research project with some a priori conclusions, but if you're willing to kind of look at the data, and Joe has, I think, frequently said we've tried to lead with the data and not sort of go on the basis of some preconception. As you know, in my prior kind of career, I helped provide tools and programs that got leaders who were brand new to a position up to speed and kind of functioning adequately. We had done a little bit of work with Tom Peters years ago and his book In Search of Excellence, and so there was a little bit of
excellence program.
There was a little bit of a tinge of that helping people to get really better. But the notion that of the enormous difference in business outcomes that the people who were in those upper deciles make, that was not part of what was on my horizon. And so I think this is a case of this is where the data kind of led us.
Which is that second point about you're using very much evidence-based approaches and really trying to bring science to this fuzzy so-called soft skills area. And so now, having done this for over 10 years, what are some examples, or maybe even a quick story or two of where you've had a real impact, where you've helped leaders or helped an organization help leaders build their strengths, and the kind of impact that that's then had?
Well, a big thing comes about when we start looking at unique competencies, and you start when people think about a competency like having confidence. You start with this sort of notion of, well, just be more confident. And then read a book.
Fake it till you make it.
Yes, I mean, it's just something. Wear better clothes. I mean, but it's fascinating because our intuition doesn't always give us great guidance. And so we just keep over and over again digging into the data and say, well, when people were confident, what other behaviors did they do? It turns out that people that are confident tended to had higher technical expertise. Now, to me, that made an enormous amount of sense to me. And I don't think it was the confident people gained expertise. I think that gaining expertise helped them to become confident, and it's probably a mixture of both. But that's where we start to uncover these secrets. Another one was inspires and motivates others. It ends up being the most significant competency, the most differentiating competency. But when anybody hears it, they go, well, Okay, how do I inspire?
Right.
We didn't know that, but we looked at the data to figure it out.
And so then as you follow that through and as you help people work on those cross-training that Jack alluded to, the companion competencies, what sort of impact do you see then a few years down the road?
The biggest impact is people walk out of our training sessions with something to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so often when people got feedback and I'd say, what are you going to work on? Say, I'm going to communicate better. And so what are you going to do? Communicate better. That's not what. So you're going to do what? Talk a lot? I mean, that was
Send
their
out more emails.
Yeah, that was their action plan. They didn't have a sense of how they would go about it.
Mm-hmm.
The companion behaviors give you these insights into people that were great and what they did to be great. But we can't intuit this stuff. We have to look at the data, and we just found it to be an invaluable tool.
The organizations with whom we've worked who have been doing this for a few years really do describe. First of all, we have some good statistical data that shows that in the eyes of their direct reports and in the eyes of their peers, these managers really have elevated in their skills.
So it's follow-up studies or follow-up
360-degree
yes.
measurements really
Right.
do indicate that they've gotten better.
Right.
But there's lots of anecdotal stories about how they've seen real transformation on the part of these leaders who have taken this seriously and have really worked hard at it and have made some very obvious changes in the way they
you
lead.
followed some of that through then to impact on employee commitment or retention or sales or whatever it may be.
The data is really clear. When leadership goes up, employee commitment goes up,
Right.
percentage of highly committed employees, percentage of employees who think about quitting goes down. It's all very consistent, and so we can track the movement of that. I think that the what we found with this, and I think my concern after doing this for 25 years with people focusing on their weaknesses is not much happened.
Mm-hmm.
People got feedback and said, oh, so that's it.
Right.
And the reason was, number one, is they were satisfied with being okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first point we make is good isn't great.
Is it almost a sense of, well, at least I've passed?
Yeah,
I feel
yeah.
like I've been
I'm not
tested and I've
pathetic.
passed. And I'm not too bad.
Right. But the second reason is that it's like, how do I get better? What do I do to get better? What do I do to improve? Right. And that's the nonlinear development, gives them that great insight. Right. And typically when people see that, bells and whistles go off, they see the connections, and they start to understand how to move forward.
Yeah, it's that sweet spot that Jack alluded to with the confluence of those three areas that I would imagine is where a lot of people start to really have those ahas and begin to work on things that they're energized about and can help to move from good to great.
Yeah, lots of that.
So in terms of the tool itself, Joe, again, Jack had talked about how most major organizations are using 360 of some sort. And so what, in your mind, I know it's been an evolution and you've been doing this kind of work for what's it been, 25, 30 years that you've been developing tools like this and working with tools like this. So you've evolved this to a real world-class sort of state. And what Jack showed kind of the 10 key things, but what few really stand out for you as being the major differences with this tool?
Well, the one that I think really differentiates it is the efficiency of the tool. It's a 15-minute assessment.
Right.
There's a lot of tools when we go into an organization, they go, oh, well, not another one of those. 60 minutes, 90 minutes, it's grueling. This thing can be done in 15 minutes. And it not only gives you the leadership effectiveness, but you get the engagement from the direct reports, and you get an importance ranking out of that and that sense of feeling. Another thing that's huge, it's such a subtle thing, but we used to ask in the 360s, we say, what are this person's strengths? And then we'd ask the second question, what could this person do to improve? Now, typically people get a long list of strengths, and then they get a long list of things that they can improve. It's the dumbest question you can ever ask. I travel a lot. If I go home and ask my wife, anything I can do to improve, honey? I'm going to hear a long list, right? And a better question for my wife is, are there any divorce issues that are imminent? So that's what we ask. We ask, is there any fatal flaws? Now, that's a kind of a bold question, but it eliminates all the fluff, and it gets people to the point where they get some feedback sometimes, not very often, but sometimes about things they really need to correct.
And that language is very deliberate. Fatal flaw. It's not derailers, or you haven't softened it as something that might get you a little off track. You deliberately use that term.
Wouldn't you like to know that? I mean, if you were a leader out there, wouldn't you like to know that there's something that's going to kill you?
Right.
That's
fatal to
ruin
my
your career. Yeah. I'd want to know that. But do you want to know all the nits and things that you could possibly be a little bit better at? They don't really. It's not that important.
Well, and the deliberate, the reason to do that so deliberately is that short of there being a fatal flaw that's really going to sink them, you want them to spend their focus and attention on their strengths.
Right.
So you don't want them to have this long list of little tiny things that they can get a little bit better at.
Right. Yeah, and I've heard it many times. In fact, I've gone into organizations, I'm sure as you have, where 360s have gotten a negative reputation because it's been a painful experience. Yeah. And it's been a nitpicking kind of, here's all your flaws or all the things that are wrong with you.
Painful, and I think biggest problem there is they didn't do anything with it.
Right.
It's sort of like a lot of work for nothing. People say, well, why are we doing all this? Because we're not seeing the change. The other thing that I think is the most profound is that we know there's a connection between the measure of 360 effectiveness that we gather and outcomes such as employee commitment, customer satisfaction, profitability, sales, all these outcomes. And so that provides the validity for the process. I mean, we're measuring something that is directly connected to organizational outcomes. Now that is something every CEO ought to be concerned about. Because we're not measuring fluffy stuff that doesn't make a difference. We're measuring issues that affect bottom line.
Jim, I would add just one more, and that is I think we alluded earlier to the fact that the items that constitute this 360-degree feedback instrument were empirically derived. And that may be a statement that kind of just floats over the head of some, because the reality in many organizations is that the list of competencies that are measured came about from a group of executives sitting around and saying, what do I think is really nice and important? And often it's the CEO who ultimately kind of puts down in on paper.
I've facilitated some of those
You've
sessions.
done this, yes. So, and it's an interesting exercise.
Yes, it can be useful.
But that's how a lot of competency models are created.
It doesn't have the validity to it, as you
But
say.
the fact of the matter is that a lot of those wonderful attributes that kind of come up in lists like that are not at all predictive of true effectiveness in the leadership role in that firm. So the fact that these items were selected as being the items that truly powerfully predicted success, in predicting the people who really would succeed in this organization, I think that's a very important kind of distinguishing characteristic of it.
It is. It's next week I'm going to be with an automaker, and I think the equivalent kind of argument there is that I showed up to the automaker with a little design I did on the airplane for a new car. Right? And they go, what's that? I said, it's a new car. It's really cool. You love it. And they go, well, what? You don't know anything about cars. Yeah, but I know I like that design, and it looks intuitively good to me. Don't you like it? And they go, well, there's engineering, there's all these things. You don't just sort of sit on a notepad. You don't know anything. You're a psychologist. What do you know about cars? And I look at that and I think about the CEO sitting down and sort of designing competencies. And yes, they understand the organization, but really, the reality is, Jim, I can look at items. I don't know the differentiating items from the ones that don't. I have to look at the data, and so do they. And that's what we've done with this, is we've got differentiating items. We've got the items that really matter. And that's why we think this instrument is so good. It's because we used data to create it. It wasn't our intuition. It wasn't our best judgment. It was good judgment, but really, it's the data that proves it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. And as I said, we're very delighted to be working with Zenger Folkman for all of those reasons. And we're actually running, well, in Canada, a couple of workshops, public workshops coming up in Calgary on November the 13th and in Toronto on November the 29th. And Zenger Folkman has one in St. Paul, Minnesota on October 22nd. All of those are open and available for anyone who would like to join in, and you'll find more information on our website about all of that. As well as, following this webcast, there will be a brief survey that we'll be sending out to everybody, and we'll be offering free copies of How to Be Exceptional, Jack and Joe and their colleagues' new book, which is really, it's of course, I have to call it an exceptional book. It is an exceptional book.
There's only one word to describe that.
Yeah, it's exceptional. But it is an outstanding book, and it really nicely summarizes so much of what we've covered here today and puts it into with lots of practical applications and ways that a reader can pick it up and run with it. So thank you very much for joining us. You can get more information on our website on all of this. We have a whole section dedicated to Zenger Folkman and the new relationship and materials and so on. And complete our survey. And look, thank you very much, Jack and Joe.
Thank you. This was fun,
Nice
Jim.
to be with you.